In late February 2024, Viorica Kondratyuk slipped a synthetic substance into her husband Sergei's soup. He survived, and then she moved on to an entirely different plan. But let's take it from the beginning. Selyatino, Narofominsk district. An ordinary evening, one of hundreds in this small town. Sergei Kondratyuk was coming home from work, exhausted after a long day. He washes his hands, sits down at the table. Viorica had already prepared everything and set the table. Soup was waiting for him. Sergei ate, and after some time, he started feeling ill. Not the way you feel from spoiled food or overwork. Different, sharp, and severe. His mother happened to be nearby at that moment, a woman with a medical background. She saw that something serious was happening to her son and immediately began helping him. What exactly she was thinking at the time, no one knows. But no ambulance was called, and certainly no police. No one ran tests, no one sent the leftover food for analysis. A couple of days later, Sergei was back at work, and the whole incident was written off as a common ailment. Overworked, ate something bad, blood pressure spike. After that, Viorica continued living as if nothing had happened, under the same roof with her husband, at the same table. She made him breakfast, served him dinner, lay down beside him. Every evening, Sergei sat at the table and calmly ate whatever she placed in front of him. Not in a fit of rage, not in hysterics. She calmly prepared the meal, set it on the table, and called him to dinner. The first attempt didn't work, but Viorica didn't stop. A few days later, she moved on to a second plan, and this time it was something else entirely. Only a few days had passed since the incident, and from the outside, everything looked as though nothing had happened. March 3rd, 2024. Sergei goes to work, eats, sleeps, lives his usual routine. Viorica does too. Except by this point, she already had an entirely different plan, and that plan involved a specific person. That same evening, Renat Kashgaliev was waiting near the house in Selyatino, a 25-year-old man, Viorica's lover. He had a hatchet and a blade with him, both just in case. The task was simple. Wait for Sergei at the entrance, attack, and finish the job. Sergei comes home from work, walks toward the building, passes by, enters the stairwell, goes up to his apartment, and goes to sleep. Renat, meanwhile, stands just a few meters away with a hatchet in his hands and does nothing. Maybe he didn't notice. Maybe he hesitated. Maybe at the last moment he lost his nerve. One way or another, Sergei walked right past the person who was supposed to meet him there and remained alive. For the second time. Renat returned to Viorica empty-handed. She didn't breathe a sigh of relief. She didn't suggest stopping. She made a scene. She was furious that her husband was still alive. 2 failures in a row. The substance hadn't worked. The ambush had fallen apart. But Viorica didn't take a single pause, didn't show a single doubt. She was angry at the result. By the very next morning, she was already building a third plan. And as it would later turn out, this time, everything was thought through very differently. March 4th. The following day, Viorica acted as if she had a ready-made plan laid out in front of her, one that had already been thought through in advance. During renovation work, Sergei didn't lock the door, and Viorica knew this perfectly well. She had given Renat the keys ahead of time and then personally brought him food, beer, and a kitchen blade into the apartment. All by herself, all in advance. Renat went inside, took the blade, took the hatchet, hid behind the door, and waited. At some point, Viorica calls her husband. Her voice is normal, calm, every day. She says she forgot to close a window in that very apartment and asks him to check on it. Sergei doesn't ask any questions. An ordinary request. Wife asks, husband goes. 17 years together, and all those years it had worked exactly like that. He leaves the house, calmly makes his way to the apartment under renovation, opens the door and steps inside. The first blow from the blunt side of the hatchet struck his face. The second, the same. Sergei fell. What followed was a strike with the blade to the neck area, and then no fewer than 5 blows with the hatchet to the head. Kondratyuk did not leave that apartment. Third attempt. Third in a single week. Sergei is on the floor. Renat stands in the middle of the apartment. his hands covered in evidence, the hatchet beside him, the blade right there. The deed is done. He calls Viorica. She picks up. Her voice is businesslike even, no questions, no pause, not a single unnecessary word. As if she had been waiting for this call and already knew what she would say. _quote _0_. It's one of those inflatable sleds. There's a bundle inside. Take it. Renat goes downstairs, finds the sled, pulls out the bundle. Dense, heavy to the touch, feels like a stack of bills. He unwraps it. Inside are novelty banknotes from a joke shop, props, paper with printed numbers, the kind sold at any prank store for a couple hundred rubles, a stack of fakes instead of the promised 1,800,000. Renat immediately calls Viorica. It rings. No one picks up. He dials again. The number is blocked. Picture this. A person who, 20 minutes ago, took another person's life with a hatchet is standing in the middle of someone else's apartment, holding a stack of toy money in his hands, and can't reach the woman who ordered it all, because she vanished. The phone is silent. In terms of real money, Renat had received 60,000 rubles on his card before that day, for buying a balaclava and work clothes, 3,000 afterward, for a return ticket home, 63,000 rubles. That's how much, in Viorica's calculations, Sergei Kondratyuk's life was worth. A disposable tool, meant to be discarded the moment it was used. Renat left with fakes in his pocket and a blocked number in his phone. But Viorica didn't stop there. She needed to go back to that apartment. She had left something behind. The apartment had already emptied by then. Sergei remained on the floor, and after some time, Viorica herself arrived, in person. Not to confirm that it was done, not to say goodbye, and certainly not to feel anything. She came for the kitchen blade. The blade had traces on it. The blade was evidence, a direct link between her and what had happened here. She took it and left. That same day, Sergei's mother tried to reach him by phone. Once, twice, 3 times. He didn't answer. For her, this was unusual because her son always picked up. She grew worried, drove to the apartment where the renovation was underway, went up to the floor and opened the door. Officers arrived quickly. The apartment immediately became a work site for the investigative team, and the surveillance cameras in the town, as it turned out, had been functioning properly. The footage was pulled that very day. Based on initial findings, the picture came together fairly fast. They detained Viorica first, but there was initially a delay with the person who carried it out. The cameras had captured the presence of an outsider near the building, but the first suspect wasn't the lover. It was Viorica's brother. He had his own history. He had previously sent Sergei messages with direct threats, openly, hiding nothing. To the investigators, this initially looked quite logical. The narrative practically sold itself. And for a while, the investigation followed this false lead. But not for long. The very next day, Renat Kashgaliev was detained. 2 arrests in 2 days. The wife and her lover, both in custody. Cameras, phones, witness statements, all of it started working against them almost immediately, and denying anything was becoming harder by the hour. But at that point, the investigation was seeing only the surface layer of this story. A woman and her young lover. Elimination of the husband. A domestic case. Dozens like it happen across the Moscow region every year, and the motive seemed obvious. He got in the way, he was a nuisance, he stood between her and some other life. A classic setup, and no one at that point yet understood that behind all of this was not an impulse and not a love story gone wrong. No one knew how long Viorica had actually been building toward this. To see that, you'd need to rewind 6 months, to the fall of 2023. That's where it all truly began. In the fall of 2023, Viorica was working at a logistics company. Ordinary job, ordinary team, nothing remarkable. And it was there that she met Renat Kashgaliev. She was 38 at the time. He was 25. A 13-year gap. A relationship between them started fairly quickly, but this was not some quiet affair on the side, the kind people usually hide and ration. Viorica went all in. She would sneak out to see Renat at night, while at home her husband and daughters were sleeping. She took out loans and split the money with her lover, not small amounts, not gifts, actual loan money, serious sums, and at a certain point, she introduced Renat to her daughters, meaning she brought him directly into the family space. For a woman who had spent 17 years cultivating the image of a quiet, patient wife, this was an absolute shift in behavior. She was no longer hiding, she was building a parallel life, openly, quickly, and expensively. Within a few months, Viorica had effectively created a second reality, one in which there was no place for Sergei. Everything looked as though she was deliberately and methodically constructing a life where her husband was simply no longer accounted for. And Sergei, during all of this, kept living the way he always had. Went to work, came home, ate what his wife left on the table, did renovation work on the mortgaged apartment. He knew nothing about Renat or the loans. In the winter of 2024, Viorica told Renat a piece of news that, as it would later turn out, changed absolutely everything. Winter of 2024. She tells Renat she's expecting his child, and almost simultaneously, she begins constructing a very specific narrative around him. Every conversation between them, one way or another, circled back to her husband. How he looked at her, how he raised his hand, how he mistreated her. Possibly true, possibly not. She would show Renat bruises and, time after time, paint a picture in which she allegedly had absolutely no way out, expecting a child by one man, tied to another, and that other man making her life unbearable every single day. At the same time, she couldn't leave because of the mortgage, the daughters, total dependence. For Renat, this framework turned out to be practically ironclad. She looked at him as if he were the only person capable of stopping it. What does a man do in that situation? Viorica, by all accounts, knew the answer to that question before she even asked it. Renat listened and believed, or at least wanted to believe, because in this version of events, he wasn't a pawn in someone else's scheme. He was the savior, not a tool, but a hero protecting his woman and his future. The difference between the two would only become clear much later. For the moment, there was a real fear for the woman and for what she was carrying. And there was Viorica, patiently waiting for the right moment to say the words that mattered most. She said them, and those very words turned a lover into an executor. Viorica didn't ask. She offered terms, concrete ones with numbers and deadlines. Get rid of Sergei, and you'll receive 1,800,000 rubles, plus an apartment. Sergei had several properties, and one of them was in Lyubertsy. She was to transfer that apartment into Renat's name. For Renat, a man working in logistics with no property of his own and no real savings, this looked like a fortune. Love, money, and a sense of justice, all in one package. Renat agreed. From that moment on, the story was no longer a drama. It became a transaction, with a specific amount, with conditions, with an asset changing hands upon completion of the job. She knew her husband's estate, knew the inheritance would more than cover her promises, and understood perfectly well how to motivate a person who, by and large, had nothing to lose. But there was something in this deal that Renat didn't account for. Viorica never intended to pay, no apartment, no money. But Renat at that moment didn't even suspect it. He believed that ahead of him lay an entirely different life. The deal was struck. All that remained was to decide exactly how to carry it all out, and Viorica didn't start with the hatchet. She chose a different path, quiet, invisible, and turned for advice to someone from whom no one would ever expect such a consultation. Viorica didn't search the internet. She didn't type anything into a search engine. She did something else. She turned to a relative, her own nephew. He had a serious dependency on substances, which meant he understood quite well which compounds in which doses could accomplish what was needed. It was to him that Viorica posed a question that, if you think about it, sounds horrifying. What could be used to make someone's passing look natural from the outside? The nephew suggested a synthetic compound. In therapeutic doses, it's used for medical purposes abroad, but in a large dose, it suppresses breathing to the point of full shutdown. A person falls asleep and simply doesn't wake up. From the outside, it looks like cardiac arrest or something sudden. No investigation, no traces, no questions. Essentially, a perfect option for a woman who sets a plate in front of her husband every night. Next, Viorica gave Renat money for the purchase. Renat found the substance, bought it, and handed it over to her. The entire chain consisted of 3 links: the one who ordered, the intermediary, and the seller. And the intermediary in this scheme was the very same person who would soon take the hatchet in his hands, meaning Renat by that point was already involved not only emotionally, his hands were in this long before March 4th. Viorica received everything she needed. She knew her husband's routine perfectly: comes home from work, tired, sits at the table, eats what's served. All that was left was to choose the right evening, make the soup, add the substance, set it on the table, and sit across from him. She did exactly that, but didn't account for one person, her mother-in-law, and that person happened to be right there at the exact moment it was needed most. Now that we know the full chain of preparation, from the nephew to the plate, we can return to the incident itself and look at it differently. Late February 2024, and here begins what truly sets Viorica apart. Not the attempt itself, but what came after. She needed to act differently. Between the failed attempt and the ambush at the entrance, only a few days passed. A few days during which Viorica was preparing dinner for one person while simultaneously sending another to wait for him with a hatchet outside. The evening of March 3rd, the same failure at the entrance, only now with details that significantly change the bigger picture. That evening, Renat wasn't just standing by the door. According to some accounts, he was stationed near the trash bins beside the entrance. Viorica, it seems, had provided him with additional motivation beyond the main agreement. She told him that Sergei would be carrying a large sum of cash on him, meaning it was no longer just about saving her and no longer just about the future apartment. It was also about money sitting right there in the pocket of the man who was about to walk past. Another lever, another argument in her construction. Before the ambush, Viorica herself brought him food and drinks. Renat ate, drank, and in the end, missed the target. Sergei calmly walked by, entered the stairwell, and went up to his apartment. He simply didn't react in time. She didn't believe him, and on the morning of March 4th, the whole thing nearly fell apart for good. A serious fight broke out between them. According to some accounts, Renat snapped. He said it outright. That's it, enough. He wasn't going to harm anyone. A direct refusal. Renat, it seems, was finally starting to grasp what exactly he had gotten into and where it was all heading. That was the very moment when everything could have gone a completely different way. Renat could have left. He could have blocked Viorica's number. He could have simply disappeared and never made contact again. And then Sergei Kondratyuk would most likely still be alive. But Viorica is not the kind of person who lets go. She played her trump card. 2 words. Our future, Viorica reminded Renat. She was carrying his child, and if he turned around and walked away now, what would happen to her? What would happen to the one she was carrying? Her husband would find out about everything sooner or later. About the lover, about the loans, about everything else. And when he found out, things would get worse. Much worse. She spoke about it as though it weren't some hypothetical threat, but something inevitable. Something that would literally happen tomorrow if Renat didn't do what he was supposed to do right now. This wasn't hysterics. This was a precisely calibrated assembly of the right words, spoken in the right order, at the right moment. Fear and masculine pride. Each of those buttons on its own might not have worked, but all of them together in a single conversation produced exactly the result Viorica needed. Renat gave in. That same day, March 4th, he went to Sergei's apartment under renovation, with a hatchet and a blade. And this time, he didn't miss. But to understand how Viorica learned to control people like this, you need to go back even further. Viorica arrived in Russia not alone, but with a daughter from her first marriage. Young, dependent, with no support system whatsoever. one of thousands of women who, in those years, came to the Moscow suburbs hoping for a stable, normal life, somewhere to get on their feet and provide something for their loved ones. There she met Sergei, married him, and Sergei did something not every man would do. He gave his last name to her older daughter, completed all the paperwork, and raised her as his own. To everyone around them, she was his. Over time, the girl herself began calling him Dad. Then a second daughter was born, their shared child. Mortgage, Celiatino, work, daily life. 17 years on the same route. Home, work, home. From the outside, it was an ordinary, solid suburban family. Not picture-perfect, not glossy, but real and alive. Sergei, by nature, was a working man. Quiet, blunt around the house, he could criticize his wife for not knowing how to manage a household, called her foolish, didn't hold back with his words. Not the easiest person to live with under one roof, that much is certain, but he shouldered the mortgage, raised 2 children, and in 17 years never once walked away. That too is a fact that shouldn't be dismissed, but from Viorica's own perspective, things looked entirely different. Viorica didn't only complain to Renat. As it later emerged, she had been doing it for years. To neighbors, acquaintances, anyone willing to listen. Her husband hit her, mistreated her, controlled her every move. And people believed her. A quiet woman from Moldova arrived alone with a child in her arms. Where could she go? What could she do? A situation people around her had seen before. They sympathized, pitied, nodded, and told her to hang in there. At the trial, Viorica presented the same version, only expanded and on the record. The marriage had long been a formality. Conflicts were regularly accompanied by physical mistreatment. She hadn't filed for divorce because her husband controlled the finances and promised to provide for the daughters only on the condition that the family stayed intact. Leaving meant losing the home, the money, and any stability. Staying meant enduring. Viorica never filed a single police report, not a single hospital visit. Not a single call to a hotline. The bruises were only seen by those she chose to show them to. Whether the mistreatment was real, the case materials don't provide a definitive answer. Sergei can no longer be asked, but one thing can be said with certainty. Viorica began building the image of a long-suffering woman long before she ever reached for the substance. Long before Renat. Long before the deal. For years, she was laying the foundation, one she could later lean on. The neighbors remembered. The neighbors, if needed, would confirm. And when it all happened, no one would be surprised. But at the trial, one detail surfaced that forced everyone to see all of this in an entirely new light. A detail from Viorica's own testimony. March 6, 2024. 2 days after Sergei stepped across the threshold of the apartment under renovation and never left, Viorica sits across from the investigator and talks. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't deny. She doesn't ask for a lawyer. She speaks, in detail, coherently, point by point. She wanted a divorce, but was afraid her husband would find out about the lover and the debts. If he found out, there'd be a scandal. If he found out about Renat, it would be even worse. And so she decided it was simpler not to divorce, but to remove him, not with her own hands. She admitted she had arranged it with Renat. He was the one who carried it out. She promised him money first, then an apartment from her husband's estate. She confirmed she knew which day, by which method, and according to which plan everything would happen. She denied nothing. According to her, that day she and Renat had been texting back and forth on various topics, and in the evening he called and said it was done. She said it the way someone talks about a completed delivery. He called. He said, he did it. That's all. At the end, Viorica wrote a statement by hand. The case could have been closed right there. A confession existed. A motive existed. The scheme was exposed. Remorse was documented. All elements in place. The investigation only needed to formalize it. But between that interview and the trial, more than a year and a half passed. And during that time, Viorica retracted every single word she had spoken on March 6th. Every single one. The confession, the motive, the scheme, the remorse, all of it ceased to exist for her, as if none of it had ever happened. What happened during that year and a half? A woman who had confessed voluntarily suddenly decided to deny everything. The answer was found in the pre-trial detention center and in the surveillance footage. Viorica and Renat were transferred to the detention facility, and whether by coincidence or by someone's oversight, they ended up in neighboring cells. There was a wall between them, but no silence. Somehow they managed to establish communication, and not just exchange a few words, they coordinated an entirely new version of events, built from scratch, and most importantly, without Viorica. In this version, everything looked like this. Viorica had simply been confiding in Renat about the mistreatment. She told him how bad things were, how impossible it was to live like that, and he, young, hot-headed, in love, decided on his own to save her. He planned everything himself, came on his own, and did what he did. She didn't know, didn't ask, didn't organize, and never promised any money or any apartment. Renat took the full blame upon himself. The very person who had received fake money, whose number was blocked the same minute he completed the job, that very person was now voluntarily shielding the woman who had used him. Why? Fellow inmates had suggested a scheme to him. If the charge dropped the element of premeditated conspiracy, the charge itself would change, not committed by arrangement with the person who ordered it, but committed on his own. And with a different charge, the possibility opens to sign a contract with the military, to go to the conflict zone instead of prison, not a sentence but service, not a penal colony but the front. For Renat, facing a long sentence, this was a real way out. Under this arrangement, Viorica would walk free. Renat would get a chance. Both come out ahead. On paper, it looked logical. Only one detail didn't fit into this construction. Viorica had already given a full confession during the interview, with specifics, with dates, with a description of the entire scheme. And to invalidate that confession, Viorica needed one more move, the most ruthless one. While in detention, Viorica told Renat she had terminated the pregnancy, the very thing for which he had agreed to everything, for which he had picked up the hatchet, for which on the morning of March 4th, after refusing and fighting, he had still gone to that apartment and done what he did. That future, according to her, no longer existed. At first glance, it looked like something beyond comprehension, but Viorica wasn't breaking him. She was insuring herself. The calculation was as follows. Renat finds out and becomes furious, possibly furious enough to stop covering for her. He goes to the investigator and starts testifying against her, tells everything about the conspiracy, the substance, the fake money, the phone call about the window, the entire scheme. And here the trap would spring. What would the court see? A person who first took the blame upon himself, then abruptly changed his testimony. Right after learning that his former lover had ended his future child. The motive for revenge, obvious. Testimony given out of revenge is automatically devalued. A court won't trust a witness who has such a deeply personal score to settle with the accused. Viorica had preemptively constructed a situation in which even the pure truth spoken by Renat would look like the revenge of a scorned lover. Every word of his would sound like an attempt to retaliate for a fatherhood that never came to be. She may have actually terminated the pregnancy, or she may have lied. But it doesn't matter. The information about the termination became a weapon. The pregnancy had once set the entire story in motion. The termination now ensured against the consequences. The same subject, working in two directions. First a lever, then a shield. But Viorica's calculation developed a crack. Working against her were the surveillance recordings, the phone records, the fact of the substance purchase, the witnesses, and her own words from March 6th, the Moscow Regional Court. Viorica Kondratyuk stands before the judge. She admits guilt in nothing, not a single count. Her version by this point had changed beyond recognition. Everything was allegedly planned and carried out by Renat on his own. She had nothing to do with it. The substance in the soup? That was a laxative, not a compound. The fake money in the snow tube? Renat himself asked her to buy novelty bills from a joke shop. Why? She didn't ask. The keys to the apartment. Renat had them because he had nowhere to stay the night. Every answer sounded as though it came from a parallel reality. Renat's testimony, first covering for her, then telling everything as it happened, formed the basis of the charges. The verdict: 17 years in a general regime penal colony, 2 years of restricted freedom after release, automatic revocation of Russian citizenship. Before the sentence was read, Viorica asked the court to release her to house arrest. She said, quote, 2. The older daughter, now 20, the same one Sergei had once given his last name, and the younger one, 9, their shared child. They now live with Sergei's mother, the very woman who saved her son after the first incident, and who later found him herself in the apartment under renovation. Renat Kashgaliev, instead of a penal colony, was sent to the conflict zone. And then there's the question, the main one, the one that still hasn't been answered. Why? To a neighbor, Viorica once said it directly, not in a whisper, not through tears, calmly, like talking about weekend plans. I'm waiting for him to save up enough money, we'll buy an apartment, and then I'll get rid of him anyway. I'm tired of him. This was said a couple of years before everything. Before Renat, before the pregnancy, before the substance, before the hatchet, before the fake money in the snow tube. Long before any of it. Long before the image of a woman backed into a corner. She wasn't backed into a corner. She was waiting. Now you can reassemble this story in full. Viorica was not the person who had been pushed to the edge over 17 years. She was the person who, all that time, lived with intent and patiently waited for the moment. Sergei was supposed to save up for the apartment first, to become valuable enough that removing him would make financial sense. Renat didn't appear as love. He appeared as a function. The bruises, the tears, the complaints to the neighbors, the image of the quiet woman, none of it was a cry for help. It was a foundation laid over years. The pregnancy became a lever. The confession was discarded. The substance was called a laxative. Even from inside a detention cell, she continued to manage. And Sergei, blunt, yes, but a man who carried a family on his shoulders. Viorica's request before the verdict, about her daughter in 2nd grade, may have been sincere, or it may have been the last mask, one that had been working for 17 years. With Viorica, you can no longer tell. Dear viewers, if something is wrong in your relationship with your partner and you're not sure about where things stand, please reach out to a family counselor. Or at the very least, talk to someone you trust. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments what you think about all of this. Take care.